Did you guys know that according to the APA, the American Psychiatric Association, that anxiety is the most commonly diagnosed disorder today? So today we are tackling the topic of anxiety. Let's dive in. It's important to first note that having worry or fear is completely normal. I think sometimes we get anxious about being worried or being fearful, but I think it is important to first state that worry and fear is just part of the human experience. Those are common emotions and feelings that we're going to experience at one time or another. The bridge between worry and fear over here and anxiety is the consistency and the excessiveness of the worry and fear and the impact it has on our daily ability to function. Oftentimes, the worry and fear will turn into anxiety when things like our eating habits start to drastically change or our sleeping habits drastically change, whether it's we're not sleeping at all or we're sleeping way too much, or we always find ourselves tired but never rested. According to the American Psychiatric Association, generalized anxiety disorder involves persistent and excessive interference with our daily ability to function. For today's video, we are going to be solely focused on generalized anxiety disorder, because when it comes to anxiety disorders, it's not just one and done. If you can picture anxiety as kind of an umbrella, under the umbrella there are different categories. So we have things like panic disorders, we have things like separation anxiety or social anxiety, or even phobias, and those are all things that will come in future videos. But for today, we're going to focus on the generalized anxiety disorder. What are going to be some of the main symptoms that we feel or that we start to see in other people? We're going to break this down into two different categories. We're going to have our behavioral symptoms and we're going to have our physical symptoms. We'll start with the behavioral. So basically how somebody or how you are starting to act and behave and kind of present yourself. So under that category, something that's going to be very noticeable is being irritable, not being able to feel like you're settled, and always being on edge and feeling like you're constantly walking on eggshells. Another big behavioral symptom of anxiety is going to be the inability to concentrate. Not being able to concentrate in class because there's an excessive worry or fear that's kind of eating at you and you're not able to be present and focus on what's happening. That's another big behavioral symptom of anxiety. But I think the two biggest changes that most people experience when it comes to struggling with anxiety is going to be number one, sleep, where we're no longer getting the amount of sleep required to feel good and rested, or maybe we're doing things out of anxiety that's keeping us up, like scrolling on social media. The other big behavioral change that most people will experience is eating. Now, this can come in a couple different ways, but the two main ways I think this tends to manifest itself is A, there's a restriction of eating. We feel like our body can't even digest food because our stomach is so tight and we feel sick every time that we eat. So all of a sudden we're not eating. The other part of the eating though can be now we are so anxious and food is the only comfort thing, or food is the only thing that we feel like we have control over. And so now we're overindulging because it makes us feel good for a moment and takes our mind off of the anxiety. Now moving over to physical symptoms of anxiety, some of the common physical symptoms that you're going to see in other people or you're going to feel for yourself. One of the most common physical symptoms that I hear about, or that doctors will tell you as well, is stomach issues. Oftentimes we feel like there's something wrong with us physically, when mentally it's creating something physically wrong with us. Anxiety will create a tension within our stomach and it feels like it's constantly in pains or cramps or just not feeling well. Another common physical symptom of anxiety is going to be headaches, whether this is tension headaches, whether this is stress headaches, but headaches of all sorts. Another one is heart racing. So you feel like you just drank 1,000 energy drinks and you can't get your heart to stop racing. Dizziness can also be another physical symptom of anxiety, and even numbness. So like numbness in your fingers or your arms or your legs or whatnot, that can also be another common physical symptom of anxiety. These are just common behavioral and physical symptoms. There are others out there. Now that we've kind of talked through what anxiety is and what it can look like, I think it's really important now to talk about some holistic ways to work through it and how to maybe even better manage it. Now, the first thing I'm going to tell you is something that I tend to tell all my clients who struggle with anxiety, and that is be kind to yourself and give yourself some time and grace to figure it out. We tend to get anxious about the anxiety. So let's say, for example, we have a test coming up and we start to feel anxious about the test. Now we start to feel bad that we feel anxious about the test, and now we just add another layer of anxiety. So when we're working through the anxiety, we first have to work through that first layer, which is the judgment and shame and the anxiety of the anxiety, until we even get to the anxiety. And so that's why I say it's really important to be kind to yourself and recognize that being anxious is not anything to be ashamed of. Being anxious is nothing to feel bad about, but it is a reality that we need to give ourselves grace for, to figure out how to better manage it. The second thing that I often tell people, and this is something I tell myself because I tend to do this as well, when we avoid something that makes us anxious, that anxiety is only going to get bigger and stronger and eventually will overtake us. One of the common therapies that people do with extreme phobias is called exposure therapy. And this is a type of therapy where you literally are seated, or you're put in the place of your biggest fear. So let's say you have a fear of spiders. What exposure therapy would do is literally put you in a room and start off with like maybe 1 or 2 spiders, and then start to add on. And the whole idea is your anxiety is greater than the reality. And so I say all that to say, when we avoid something that makes us anxious, that strengthens the thing that's making us anxious. When we allow ourselves to face it, when we allow ourselves to be exposed by it, when we allow ourselves to recognize, okay, I'm about to walk into something that makes me really anxious, we tend to get stronger. We will end up recognizing, wait a minute, the anxiety was far greater than the reality. A big part of working through anxiety is facing the anxiety. We can't avoid what's making us anxious, because eventually what's making us anxious will overtake us. But when we face what's making us anxious, we will overtake it. The third thing that I think is important when working through anxiety, or ways to maybe overcome anxiety, is to be mindful of what we're listening to and what we're watching. So sometimes when we're anxious, we tend to go to things that make us feel comfortable. So things like social media. And I'll use an example where I know sometimes when I get really anxious about my job, or even doing this, let me ignore this and let me go to social media and just scroll, because that's just mindless. However, what happens is I start to see other people producing things that I want to produce, or I start to see people living the life. I'm like, yeah, that's what I want. And then what I'm watching is now creating more anxiety within me, and even possibly creating more doubt within me of my ability. And this also pertains to music and to shows that we watch. Sometimes we love the idea of being scared and being, frightened or whatnot when it comes to movies. But the truth is, sometimes when we indulge too much in that, now what we're watching, we are fearing. So true crime, which I am a true crime junkie, love the podcasts and Dateline and all the above. However, it's important to recognize that when we're feeling anxious about certain things and then we watch things like that, it's only going to build the anxiety. Now, I also think it's important to recognize maybe some things to do outside of feeling anxious, almost like a preemptive strike to feeling anxious. Something that I always remind my clients is sometimes we wait to be in crisis or when we're at the peak of our anxiety to apply helpful coping skills. But I think it's important to practice those things outside of it, so when the anxiety comes, it'll just be kind of like memory, and it'll come back to us and we'll do it without thinking. Or it will even lessen the possibility of anxiety because of how we are maybe preemptively preparing for it, if that makes sense. So a couple things there. I think number one, creating a clean space. Now, this is relative, and this doesn't mean everything has to be perfect and in order, but things like making our bed, or maybe cleaning out the dishes every morning, or really just organizing our space to where we feel at peace and we feel calm, can be a great way to limit the possibility of future anxiety, and it can just be a way to feel calm and at peace, because it is something that we do have control over. When we're in a calming space externally, we tend to mirror that internally. Another thing that we can do outside of feeling anxious that will help lessen the anxiety is create a routine. And again, this is relative. I know routines sometimes scare people, like, well, that means I have to be up at 6 a.m. I know for me, sometimes I watch these TikTokers that are like, here's my 5 to 9 before my 9 to 5. And I'm like, oh, that is not me. And that's okay. Their routine does not need to be your routine. Honor where you're at in this season while also challenging yourself a little bit to say, okay, what can I do on a daily basis, on a weekly basis that's going to create consistency and a feeling of routine? Because again, that is something that we do have a say-so in. So whether it's maybe every morning you wake up for the first 30 minutes, you don't get on your phone and instead you make your bed and make some breakfast. Or maybe it's you wake up and the first thing you do instead of your phone is journaling. Whatever works for you, having a routine can be the best thing for our mental and emotional health. especially when it comes to anxiety. Another kind of preemptive way to prepare for possible anxious moments or lessen anxious moments is journaling. This is something that's so huge and something that I will die on this hill, that journaling can be so impactful, especially when feeling anxious or even outside of anxious moments, to lessen the anxiety. When we're able to spill our thoughts and heart onto something else outside of our head, it just helps A, rationalize irrational thoughts, B, it just helps get out of our head and clear our head, and C, it physically gets us to do something, so then we're able to work through the anxious thought in a much more productive way. So those are a few ways to maybe prepare outside of the anxious moments so we can lessen the possibility of anxiety, or when we're anxious, it'll be kind of like, again, just a memory that comes back, and we'll know how to use it because we've been practicing outside of the moment, that when we're in crisis or in anxiety, those coping skills or those things will be brought back to memory and help lessen the impact of the anxiety. Faith is a huge part in my mental and emotional health journey. I do want to share some scripture that helps me in times of anxiety that will hopefully help you as well. The first one being Psalm 23. This is one of my favorite passages in scripture ever. This is a verse I come to in and outside of anxious moments and seasons. And it says that the Lord is my shepherd. I have what I need. He lets me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters, and he renews my life. He leads me along the right paths for his name's sake. Even when I go through the darkest valley, I fear no danger. For you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, and my cup overflows. Only goodness and faithful love will pursue me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord as long as I live. Even with faith, it's never promised that dark valleys won't come, that anxious moments won't come. But it is promised that when we go through those moments, when we go through the darkest moments, that the goodness of God is still there and that the Lord is still there. And so this is something that I just speak over my life, over your life, but something that I genuinely connect to, especially in anxious seasons. The second verse that I really love and something that has helped me through a lot of anxiety or anxious moments is Isaiah 41:10, which it literally says, "Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be afraid, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will hold on to you with the righteousness of my hand." I love this because in moments when my heart and mind start to fear or things start to happen and I get really overwhelmed with anxiety, I have to remind my heart and my soul, do not fear, because the Lord is with me. And something that can be really helpful when struggling with an anxious moment especially is that speaking scripture in those moments, although it may not immediately feel better, it will help remind our heart and mind of what is truth. Anxiety will often lie to us. Our anxious thoughts will often lie or exaggerate to us. And if we don't have truth to combat it, it'll be really hard to work through it or manage it. And then the last scripture that I want to read that has been helpful for me when dealing with anxiety is Matthew 6:34. And it simply says, "Therefore do not worry about tomorrow, because tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own." For me, it's just a reminder of I have to stay in this moment. I have to choose to stay present when my anxiety is trying to convince me to not be present. So the last thing I want to talk about before we officially close this video out are some ways to work through an anxiety attack. Which, quick clarification, there is a difference between an anxiety attack and a panic attack. Anxiety attack is more internal and often builds. Panic attack is more physical and often will just come out of the blue. So here are 3 categories that are going to be helpful to you. Number 1 is going to be focusing on your breathing. Now, I know it's painful and it's annoying when people say, just breathe, all that stuff, but it can be helpful to know that focusing on your breath is going to help calm your system down. Now, if you are with somebody who's experiencing a panic attack or anxiety attack, please do not say to them, just breathe, you're fine, but breathe with them. So whether that's, in for 4, hold for 2, out for 4. Number 2, which breathing can technically fall under, but that's going to be grounding yourself. It is going to be crucial to ground yourself. Again, if you are with somebody who's maybe experiencing an attack in that moment, Something that can be really helpful is help them do the 5-4-3-2-1 rule, which is 5 things you see, 4 things you hear, 3 things you smell, 2 things you taste, and 1 thing that you can touch. Anxiety attacks will take us out of the moment, and it's hard to recognize that we are safe and that we are grounded and that we are here. Another way to ground yourself is if you're home or if you're in a home, grab some ice cubes and put them in your hand. That will A, shock your nervous system to help bring you back, and 2, it will help take your mind off anxiety and help you refocus and recenter. And the third category is connecting to a safe person within your community. A trick that I tell people in my office is in your core friend group, which this should only be about 4 or 5 people, maybe pick 1 or 2 people that you trust and use a code word. So like, let's say coffee, and make that code word coffee something that you use when you're feeling symptoms of anxiety attack coming along. And so that way those 2 people or that 1 person will know, okay, coffee, she's going through or they're going through this, let me reach out, let me do this, and give them tools and tricks that help you outside of the moment. So when the moment comes and you text coffee, they will be able to meet with you or know what to do with you or just know how to partner with you when you're feeling the anxiety attack. Community is such a big part in bettering our mental and emotional health, and oftentimes anxiety will isolate us. And so when we're in community though, anxiety has a hard time kind of existing. When we isolate ourselves, anxiety will completely take over. So I'm hoping that this video was informative, it was somewhat helpful, and that you are able to take some of the things learned here and apply them if you struggle with anxiety, or share them with somebody who may struggle with anxiety. As always, I am so honored that you decided to tune in and watch this video. If you are interested in all things mental and emotional health, therapy, or faith, I would love for you to join the family and go hit the subscribe button. Be sure to come back next week for more mental and emotional health tips, tricks, and information. Until next time.